Okay, so we're diving deep today into something I think a lot of us have thought about, especially if you're learning English, and that's like literally thinking in English, you know?
Right, right.
And you guys sent in a really interesting resource, a transcript from the LEP Learn English podcast. And it's called How to Think More in English Podcast and Chill Beginner. So, right off the bat, we know it's for beginners, but I think there's a lot to unpack here for everyone, no matter where you're at on your English language journey.
Absolutely. And, it's funny because I think a lot of times when we think about thinking in English, we have these kind of preconceived notions about what that means, and those can actually be pretty misleading.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the transcript starts off by being really clear about what thinking in English is not.
Yeah,
Like, it's not about having this perfect English monologue going on in your head 24/7. It's not like you're narrating your life in perfectly formed sentences with a perfect accent. That would be exhausting.
totally, totally.
Yeah.
First of all, who has that kind of mental bandwidth?
Right. And like, even in our native languages, I don't think most people are walking around with this perfectly grammatically correct internal dialogue.
No, no, definitely not. Thoughts are often much more, you know, fragmented, kind of like stream of consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing that the transcript points out is that it's not about erasing your native language. Like, you don't have to completely suppress your native language in order to think in English. It's not like this binary switch.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And in fact, I think, trying to force yourself to completely forget your native language could actually be counterproductive.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, you're not trying to replace one language with another. It's more about developing this additional way of processing information.
Right. And bilingualism in general is really fascinating because it kind of shows how our brains are capable of handling multiple linguistic frameworks at once.
And the transcript also makes a really good point about translation. It's like even advanced speakers still sometimes translate in their heads. It's not like you reach this magical point where you never translate anything ever again. It can still be a useful tool.
Oh, for sure. For sure. So especially when you're dealing with, new vocabulary or complex ideas. I mean, sometimes translation is just the most efficient way to make sense of things.
Right. And it's not a weakness or anything, it's just part of the process.
Absolutely. So, we've talked about what thinking in English isn't.
Yeah.
So now let's get into what it actually is, according to the Learn English podcast. And one of the first things they mention is this idea of direct processing.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. So, what does that actually look like? Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So basically, direct processing is when you hear an English word and you immediately understand the concept behind it without first having to translate it into your native language. Like if you hear the word dog, you picture a dog in your mind right away, instead of thinking of the equivalent word in your native language first.
Right. So, it's like you're cutting out the middleman, that translation step.
Exactly, exactly. And what's really cool about this is that, as you get better at direct processing, it can actually help you process English faster in real-time conversations.
Oh, wow, that makes sense. Like, if you're not having to mentally translate everything all the time, you can actually keep up with the flow of the conversation more easily.
Right, precisely. And another sign that you're starting to think in English is that you can understand non-visual concepts directly in English, like, you know, jokes or idioms. You don't have to translate them back into your native language to get the humor or the meaning.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, sometimes the humor in a joke is really tied to the specific language it's told in.
Exactly. And when you start to pick up on those nuances, it's a really good sign that you're developing a deeper understanding of the language as a whole.
And then there are those, like, automatic responses, like those phrases that just come out in English without you even having to think about them.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if someone says, "Hi, how are you?" and you immediately respond with, "I'm good, how are you?" without even having to consciously construct that sentence in your mind.
Right, it just comes out naturally.
Exactly. Exactly. And that kind of automaticity is another sign that your brain is getting more comfortable operating in English.
So the Learn English podcast also talks about these micro moments, which I thought was a really interesting concept. It's like at these little, almost invisible instances where you're actually thinking in English without even realizing it. Can you give us some examples of what those might look like?
Yeah, for sure. So, one example would be if you're scrolling through social media and you see a post with an English caption and you just understand it immediately without having to translate it, like maybe it's a meme or a short video, and your brain just processes the English directly.
Oh, yeah, that happens to me all the time, especially with those like short, common phrases that you see online.
Right, exactly. And that's a prime example of your brain thinking in English. It's like it doesn't even need to go through that translation step anymore.
Yeah, it's like it's becoming more of a reflex.
Exactly, exactly. And another example might be if you find yourself using common English interjections like, oh my God, or thank you, even when you're not speaking English.
Yeah, I do that too. It's like those phrases have just become part of my vocabulary, regardless of what language I'm speaking.
Right, exactly. And it shows how English is starting to integrate into your everyday thought processes.
Okay, so this is all really interesting, but why do you think it is that we might not realize that we're thinking in English? Like, if it's happening, why wouldn't we be aware of it?
Well, I think part of it is that our brains are really good at doing things on autopilot,
Hmm.
you know? Like we don't consciously think about every single breath we take or every step we make. A lot of it just happens automatically in the background.
Right, so it's like our brains are just so efficient that we don't even notice all the amazing things they're doing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, there's also this theory from linguist Stephen Krashen that a lot of language acquisition happens subconsciously through exposure to what he calls comprehensible input.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. It's like we're constantly absorbing language from our environment, even if we're not consciously studying it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So all those times you're listening to English music or watching English movies, even if you don't understand everything, your brain is still picking up on patterns and absorbing information.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it also ties into this idea of automaticity, which is something that the Learn English podcast mentions as well. It's like the more you practice something, the more automatic it becomes, and the less you have to consciously think about it.
Right, exactly. So,
Hmm.
when you first start learning English, you have to consciously think about every word you say and every grammar rule you use.
Mm.
But as you get more practice, it becomes more automatic.
Like driving a car, you know? At first, you have to think about every single thing you do, the steering wheel, the pedals, the mirrors. But after a while, it just becomes second nature.
Exactly, exactly. And the same thing can happen with thinking in English. As you get more practice, it becomes less effortful and more automatic, so you don't even notice that you're doing it.
So, okay, we've identified these subtle signs of thinking in English. We've talked about why we might not be aware of it. So now let's talk about some practical strategies for actually noticing and encouraging these moments, because I think that's really what a lot of people are interested in.
Absolutely. And the Learn English podcast has some really great tips for this.
Hmm.
And one of the simplest but most effective things they suggest is to just catch yourself in the act.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Well, it basically means to pay attention to those moments when you find yourself thinking in English, even if it's just for a brief moment. Like if you're reading a sign in English and you understand it right away,
Hmm.
or if you find yourself humming an English song in your head, just take a moment to acknowledge that, hey, I'm thinking in English right now.
So it's like bringing more awareness to those little moments.
Exactly. And by becoming more aware of those moments, you're actually reinforcing those neural pathways in your brain that are associated with thinking in English.
Makes sense, but I think for some people it might be hard to like consciously monitor their thoughts all the time, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And that's why the podcast also suggests some other strategies that can be really helpful. Like, for example, they recommend trying to write a short journal entry in English every night before you go to bed.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. And they emphasize that it doesn't have to be anything fancy, just a few sentences about your day or something that's on your mind.
Right. Exactly. The point is not to write a perfect essay. It's just to get in the habit of expressing your thoughts in English on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think that's really important. It's like the more you use English in a natural way, the more comfortable you'll become with it.
Absolutely. And another great tip they have is to try to do small, everyday tasks while thinking in English. Like, for example, if you're making coffee in the morning, you could narrate the steps to yourself in English in your head. Okay, now I'm grinding the beans, now I'm pouring the water, now I'm adding the milk.
So it's like you're giving yourself a little English lesson in the midst of your daily routine.
Exactly. And it can be a fun way to practice without it feeling like a chore.
And the transcript makes a good point about not putting too much pressure on yourself to use advanced vocabulary or perfect grammar when you're doing these exercises. Like, the goal is just to get comfortable with the process of thinking in English, not to sound like a Shakespearean actor.
Totally. I mean, using simple language is perfectly fine. In fact, it's probably better when you're first starting out.
Right, because if you're constantly struggling to find the perfect word or the perfect grammar rule, it's going to make the whole process feel more difficult and less enjoyable.
Exactly. And, the podcast also includes a section where they talk about some specific signs that you might already be thinking in English. even if you don't realize it.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. And a lot of it comes back to those micro moments we were talking about earlier. Like if you find yourself understanding English phrases without translating them, or if you start mixing English words into your everyday conversation.
Right, exactly. Those are all good indicators that English is starting to become more ingrained in your thinking.
And to help illustrate this, they give some examples of common English phrases and their meanings, like light bulb moment, which means a sudden realization or a great idea, or roll off the tongue, which means something is easy to say.
Yeah, I love that one. Roll off the tongue. It's such a descriptive phrase.
It is. And then there's catch on, which means to understand something. Under the radar, which means to go unnoticed. And sleep on something, which means to postpone a decision until the next day.
Right. And what's interesting about these phrases is that they often don't have a direct equivalent in other languages. So when you start to understand them intuitively in English, it's a sign that you're really starting to think within the English framework.
So it's like you're not just translating words anymore, you're actually understanding the nuances of the language and the culture.
Exactly, exactly. And, I think the key takeaway from all of this is that thinking in English is not some magical event that happens overnight. It's a gradual process that happens over time as you continue to expose yourself to the language and practice using it in different ways.
Right, and it's probably happening more often than you realize. You just have to start paying attention to those little moments.
Absolutely. And the more you notice those moments and the more you practice thinking in English, the more natural and effortless it will become.
So, for all of you listening out there, as you continue on your English language journey, I want to leave you with a little challenge, inspired by the Learn English podcast. See if you can remember the very first time you noticed yourself understanding or using English without consciously translating. What were you doing? What were the circumstances? And what do you think might have contributed to that moment? Take some time to reflect on that because I think it can be a really powerful way to appreciate how far you've come and to motivate yourself to keep going.
And remember, every little step you take, every little moment of thinking in English is a victory. So celebrate those victories and keep up the amazing work.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive today, everyone. We'll see you next time.